questions for him, some based on and some which are more general from an India perspective. We encourage to ask questions. You could raise your hands on the chat room and our admin will unmute you and you could ask questions at that time. Which on boards and managements and organizations should be doing going forward in this situation.
Thank you, Raj. I'll be using my slide share function here, and I hope everything is working properly. If not, I'm sure someone will let me know in the process here.
Yes. We can see you, we can hear you loud and clear.
Very good.
And we can see your slides. Yep.
Oh, good. All is well with the world. As you already know, the impact of the coronavirus and it's had on our lives and our economies has been very extreme, very dire. The World Bank Group in April said global GDP is expected to decline by 2.5%, which is a huge secular drop for such a short period of time. And for developing countries, this decline is going to be even worse, 2.5%. The biggest GDP losses are expected to come in East Asia and the Pacific region. As you can see here, the World Bank consensus is that India's economy will face its worst recession in 40 years, with the economy contracting by at least 5% this fiscal year. And the S&P Global Ratings predict the Indian economy will contract another 5% in fiscal year 21. For the world's corporations, this has brought huge challenges and enormous uncertainty, and that extends to the very top of the world's corporations, into the corporate boardroom. Boards and directors worldwide have been used to convening in their boardrooms every few months to oversee the normal flow of operations, literally going back centuries with the boardroom model that's used pretty much throughout the developed world. But now, for several months, boards have had to meet remotely while coping with multiple crises that can destroy the company. Going forward, they're going to have to plan a route back to normal operations, and all of this while dealing with uncertain rules, with extreme limitations, and a very weak economy. Let's take a look at these issues in turn. First is the matter of simply how do boards of directors manage to meet when they can't literally meet together? All of you attending today have grown familiar with online video meeting technology in the last few months. Otherwise, you wouldn't be attending today. But using this technology to conduct board meetings that are safe, that are effective and legal is a real challenge. First, let's assume that you've assured your board can legally do business with telephonic and online technology. Earlier this year, the Indian government relaxed some of the rules on when boards of directors have to meet in person. This lets the standards for online and telephonic meetings that are laid out in the Companies Act of 2013 and the Companies Rules Act of 2014 for convening and conducting audiovisual board meetings come into play. These meetings will be considered legal and legitimate as long as certain factors are respected here. And you can see the rules that we're talking about. I like this listing here. It applies specifically to India, but frankly, I'm going to borrow this list and put it in my future presentations worldwide, because it covers some of the things that you really have to address in dealing with an audiovisual online meeting of the board. All of the niceties that really need to be attended to: notice of meetings, ability to participate effectively, ascertaining quorums, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes here. Ability for participants to come in and make their identity known and make their questions known. Making the chairperson in charge of the important aspect of recognizing speakers and recognizing contributors before they come forward. And best of all, the use of minuting of the meeting. I'll address that as well, but the importance of attending to all of these niceties of the and legalities of board meetings are crucial to make sure that it's handled well. One final comment I'll make on this: many of the SEBI and MCA stock exchange waivers that were put in place a few months ago for board and shareholder meetings, timing, personal attendance, notification, are going to be expiring at the end of June. And they may or they may not be extended. They may be modified. There may be inconsistencies in how they're extended. So it's vital for your board and your company legal staff to stay up to the minute on these regulations, how they're going to change, because something that could be legal from a governance point of view in India this week may not be next month. So definitely keep on top of that. The next step in dealing with virtual governance is assuring that your hardware and software are available and able to make it happen. Now, I'd like to go through this step by step, starting with the low-tech options. We're talking right now about some of the wonderful, cool online virtual video conference tools that are available. Sometimes it might well be smarter to stick with a simple telephone conference meeting of your board for a quick approval of urgent matters or general catch-up or a genuine emergency. I've found that you simply can't beat patching everyone into a telephone call. Most of the regulations in India and worldwide on how remote board meetings should work were originally written for telephonic meetings anyway, so the infrastructure is all there. Simplicity has its value, particularly in the boardroom. Next, I'd like to have you make good use of the electronic tools that you already have in place for your board, how they meet, and the data that they use. You may well now be using an online board portal platform. And this is something, by the way, I encourage. The costs of using board portals for information sharing have come down sharply in the last few years. You can find one that meets your budget and your needs all around the world. In fact, here are some of the more popular ones worldwide that most of you are probably familiar with. Make a quick study of the online video meeting, voting, and data sharing tools that your current portal allows you. I've found often boards aren't making full use of their current portals, and you may discover that you have some great meeting helpers tucked away in your menu just waiting to be found. Online board info delivery and review. This is likely to be a big part of your virtual meeting, so invest some time now in preparing and testing out your portal. What are its capabilities, and what can you be really using to exploit that? What are some of the useful tools that you might have tucked away in a board portal that you could be using now? One example comes up in board dissension and even disagreements. These are the sort of things that are usually negotiated outside the boardroom in a one-on-one cloakroom chat to come up with an agreement and a compromise. With remote board sessions nowadays, this sort of a compromise approach might never happen, or directors might substitute texting or emailing during the meeting to negotiate. The problem with that, I've found, is that the text and messaging technology that most of us are using with our smartphones is not only insecure, but it can create a later scary disclosure trail. You're leaving a lot of information out there that isn't being gathered in corporate records. And this is something that can come back to bite you and can actually be exposed. And you really don't want that happening with board business. The board portals, almost all of the ones shown here that I've found, offer secure one-on-one messaging between the board chair, between individual members of the board, back and forth. And this can be controlled by the moderator of the meeting. Portal chat functions are designed with governance legalities in mind, and they let you and your legal counsel fine-tune how these chats are retained, how they're privileged, who has access to them. So if you're going to be talking in the board meeting, look into that board portal technology. It gives you the support that you really want. Most board portals I found also have great online polling features. Now, before putting an item to the vote, we know that the chair really wants to get an idea of the climate of the boardroom, who's supporting, who isn't. This is useful. Boards today in the remote situations are cut off from their ability to judge the climate in the boardroom. It can be difficult when you're just looking at a bunch of little postage stamp pictures of people on the screen. Most portals today offer this ability. You can do quick online polling informally of members, everyone who likes this idea or doesn't. Use that capability before you take a formal vote. You'll be glad you did. The next thing I'd like to, and this is a slide we're looking at now, is crafting of dashboards of indices and metrics to get a quick temperature check on what's happening with financials, with production, with all sorts of the metrics that you need in business. I have found boards are using a lot more of these dashboard visual characteristics now, and most portal technology offers that. Remote governance of fast-changing matters makes a quick visual overview of the data invaluable. You want to know what's happening right now, and dashboards are a great tool for doing that. Many companies today are using collaboration tools such as Microsoft Teams or Slack among their management teams. It's very popular. But for sensitive issues, the types that boards are dealing with nowadays, I've found that it is actually working back the other way. Boards of directors are setting up privileged workspaces for management inside of their board portal systems. You're dealing with a lot of really sensitive items at the moment. Furloughs, layoff, compensation cuts, employee health issues, emergency succession. These are things that are really sensitive, and it's unwise to cover them in the general management collaboration platforms where everyone might have access. And you might want to have a privileged spot where the board and the top managers that you designate can only tap in and talk about what's going on. Now, as to video conferencing tools that you need for a virtual boardroom, you're likely using Zoom, as we are today, or Cisco WebEx, GoToMeeting are a few of the popular ones, and there are many local platforms that are popular and useful as well. Your company tech staff and IT people will be familiar with these platforms, and most of the directors that you have in the board are already using them in their quote-unquote outside day jobs. So they know the nuances of online conferencing. This is something everyone's had to get comfortable with over the last couple of months. But in a board context, currently your directors are logging in from their homes, from wherever they happen to be at the moment. They have a variety of hardware. The computer they're using at their end brings its own operating system. Conferencing software needs to be downloaded. All of this can create problems. Some of the online video conferencing programs work better on different operating systems than on others. The web browsers your board members are using often make video and displays look different for you than they will at company headquarters. Their home and personal hardware might also not be using the latest version of their browsers or operating systems. So it's important to prod your remote directors to upgrade their software. One virtual board meeting concern that can show up, and it'll usually happen at the last moment with a video conference, is pipeline problems. You have your company computer networks, the conferencing servers, and then your director's last mile connections all getting together. And when that happens, bandwidth and buffering issues can pop up. People start blurring and humming, people get stuck. And also the whole world at the moment is trying to do business online, and that can lead to data traffic jams. And finally, there's the human factor with your board members yourselves. And I found this is one of the most difficult ones to deal with. If you have a board member who's attending a board meeting, talking about sensitive company issues, and they're attending with their smartphone while strolling through a public marketplace, there are going to be all sorts of dangerous security issues that pop up. This is why it's important from the top down for the board chair and the management to lay out protocols on the equipment your directors use and where and how they're going to use it. Stress good behavior and professionalism. Your IT staff, the company secretary, and the board chair also need to verify and practice early to assure that your technology that may work great in theory is actually functioning in practice when you get all of these remote directors chipping in on a board meeting. Now next, the global lockdown has driven the way boards actually meet, how they're conducting their business, and how they stay informed. This is something that's actually an opportunity for you to do governance better than you may have ever done it before. In a May article in the Economic Times, Harsh Genka, chairman of the $3.8 billion US RPG group, said the quote that you're seeing on your screen now. And he raises some excellent points that all boards around the world are discovering, that going online allows some more informality and quickness, and it matches the pace of change that companies are dealing right now. Some of the everyday problems you're better able to handle in real time. Things can be quickly done, and you're able to sweep away some of the busy work and other factors that tend to bog down board meetings. I have an entire webinar on making board meetings more effective, and we don't have time to go into all of these tips and tools, but there are a few specifics that we'd like to mention here that particularly work well with dealing with online governance today, and indeed the governance boards need in the current environment. And the first is the idea of a separate standalone board meeting, quote unquote, itself. It's coming under question. In-person board and committee meeting programs. In the old school, old style of doing things, you would get everyone together for a day or maybe 2 days. It sounds good. That's the way that we were all raised to do corporate governance. But you're never going to do a 2-day conference call. It just doesn't work. There's no way you can get everyone sitting down and looking at their phone or at their screen for that amount of time. Virtual board meetings should break up into more modular, bite-sized pieces. The maximum for a virtual board session today is about 2 hours. That's the most you can get everyone sitting and looking at a screen. And then you have a break or you shift to other business, because this approach lets you better integrate committee meetings of the board. Virtual meetings break down the traditional walls between the board and the board's individual committees, which is really where you'll find most of the work is going on today in the boardroom. Most video meeting platforms let the administrator toggle back and forth between full groups and subgroups. Committees can even duck out for a quick chat on the side while the full board is meeting. But this is a time to mention something that's very important. Note that the governance legalities you have to meet on things like quorums, on attendance, and recording votes is trailing behind the technology in some cases. So you have to assure good minuting of board and committee actions. This is very crucial, and it's something that tends to get lost. Harsh Genka mentioned the benefits of informality. This is one area where you don't want to be informal. In a year or two, you don't want to find yourself in court with poor or no records of how your remote board meeting was handled. For that matter today, why not just shake up the board agenda to better work with your virtual meeting realities? Directors can put the time that they're in isolation to good use with better, more intense review of board books and materials in advance of the meeting. Then the board meeting that you had everyone gathered around their computers for can be devoted to FaceTime and put into better discussion and votes on things. The peripheral items of governance can be handled outside of the meeting, and you can put more time into the real work that you need for governance. Some board agenda elements are just not going to work in a remote meeting, or at least not well. This includes general education items, training, busy work, other items that can be best postponed for later in the year. Overall, I found it's best to push off big strategic discussions, items like mergers and acquisitions or sale of big assets of the company, until you can get people together in person, if that's possible to do. But as we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, sometimes this might actually be a better time to take on those big topics. Now, board materials and presentations, I've found, are changing too to meet these new formats. No more mind-numbing PowerPoint slideshows or staffers reading off long reports. How many of you have been in a board meeting when you've seen slide after slide on the screen go on for half an hour, and then a staffer, to make things worse, reads through every one of those slides, putting you to sleep? Directors aren't going to sit through an hour-long slideshow like that anymore. So make sure that your board portal has all of the up-to-minute board book information, and that staff practice on any remaining slide decks that they're going to use. Or better still, have your directors look over these slide decks in advance and just give a quick review in the meeting itself. Now, all of this trimming for board meetings doesn't mean that your board skimps on its overall governance duties. Instead, they allow boards to better chat among themselves outside of board meetings, working out issues, coming to consensus, and then using the online time for the formalities and the group discussion that they need to. I've found that there's a lot more interaction between members of the board now and members of the board and management outside of the actual board meeting itself. As I said earlier, the idea of a standalone board meeting is eroding at the edges. Make that an advantage. Moving on, the road back. How do we go back from the crisis that we're currently facing? The world's economies are emerging now from the COVID-19 shutdown. The crisis response for boards and management of putting out immediate fires that's been really needed over the last couple of months is shifting now to long-term company survival and fighting your way back. Today, companies are heading into the second half of this year, the fiscal year, and the board role is just as crucial now. It might even be more vital because instead of seeing the company through an immediate crisis, the board now has to help plot a course toward a long-term sustainable future for the company when everything around them is changed. This is a huge task. Most of the burden is going to fall on your management team, but the board should be asking a few important questions on how they plan to handle the comeback and their stability plans. First question, how have short and long-term financials been hit by the crisis? How are the projections for revenues, for cash flow, liquidity, and so on going to change over the remainder of the year? How good are our projections on these? How solid are they? What is the status on our lines of credit, our loan covenants, and other financing? How long will, or how will our long-term investments and capital spending plans have to change? Next, how healthy are our suppliers, our customers, banks, vendors, transport, logistics, all of the other people we depend on? What do we know about any changes that they're facing now in their stability, capacity, and ownership? Are there disruptions in delivery, on timeliness, support, and pricing that we need to watch out for? Have we looked into renegotiating things like leases, contracts, payments, or loans? And I mentioned a minute ago, big things like M&A, but now is the time to ask, are there any merger or acquisition, purchase, or big strategic talent opportunities we should seize at the moment? When everyone is in distress, we might be in distress too, but if everyone else is, this could be a good time to find some real bargains out there if we're willing to be brave and we can support it and seize the moment. Next, the board should ask to see details and timelines on plans for reopening facilities and recalling employees. What steps will we take to assure employee safety? What are projected payroll, employment, and hours worked over the next quarter, and how do they compare to the first quarter of the year? What layoffs and furloughs have been required from us, if any, and what have we done to ease the impact for our people? Have we made pay cuts, and how were they used from the top to the bottom of the company? And finally, the board needs to ask, what messages are shareholders, family owners, promoters, and regulators giving us going forward? What messages have they been giving us over the last couple of months? Have they been supportive of our crisis management, of our leadership team, our strategic shifts? What concerns can we expect from them going into 2021? This pretty much covers what I have to say for how we got into the situation, how boards are dealing with it and going forward. But I'd like to address any questions now that we have, and I know that there have been several out there. Raj, Munir?
Yes, Ralph. Thank you very much. That was a very insightful look at what boards should be doing and what companies should be doing. The first part of what you spoke about deals a lot with the whole issue of virtual meetings and how to make them more effective. Before I go into a little more strategic questions that I had, an immediate question that sprung to mind was, what would your advice be to the company secretaries of organizations? Because a lot of the virtual board meetings and organizing a lot of the work that you've just mentioned in the first part of your presentation is going to be actually actioned by company secretaries and calls for a very high digital quotient. Yeah? Given that, and to make that shift very quickly, what would your advice be to them? And what should they have as their priorities, the first 3-4 things immediately?
That's a good question, because the company secretary, who often handles also some of the legal functions, are the ones who are in the hottest of hot seats on this. They have to maintain this. And as I mentioned earlier, with all of the changes in listing requirements, reporting, and disclosure coming so fast, the company secretary has to be the one to keep track of what's happening day by day. It's important for them to put together a good listing of what laws and regulations we're operating under at the company at the moment and how they have to change, and then make sure to share that information with the board chair, with the chief executive. They're all putting out fires on their own and simply don't have time to do that. And also, company secretaries need to do a better job today of keeping track of members of the board of directors, how to contact them. Good corporate secretaries I've found, and this is another area where I have a webinar of information on best practice for company secretaries. Most of them have a very good Rolodex or day book of how to get in touch with outside members of the board, their executive assistants at any time, 24/7. It's very important. A lot of those things have been shaken up now because the members of the board aren't where they were a few months ago. They may be sheltering in place. They may even be out of the country. Keeping track of where the members of the board are, the time zones that they might be in, how their numbers and contact information has changed is an important task for the company secretary now as well. And I mentioned earlier the importance of finding out what your current technology is for data distribution, use of board portals, other electronic media for the board. The company secretary is the one who is the keeper of that. And they're the ones who have to really dig in, well, what can we do now that we haven't been doing before? And how can we make the best use of it? And also, this is something I mentioned in passing, but with directors out there in the field getting and receiving information, sending and receiving text messages and phone calls of important company information, a lot of those media aren't as secure as we would like them to be. One thing that's been noticed, this is a US phenomenon, but I suspect it's happening worldwide. The amount of cybercrime and hacking has gone up massively over the last month because the hackers are opportunistic. They know there are a lot of people out there using new technology, probably using insecure servers that they may not have been a few months ago, and they're taking advantage of that. And if you think of it, your board members have the keys to the company in their pocket when it comes to information, data, projections, financials. You want to keep that information secure. The company secretary working with IT staff has to make that a top priority. I know that's a lot to do, but that's what I would suggest.
Thank you. That's the very long list of things for them to focus on. I'm going to dial back a bit on the other elements that you mentioned about board's focus. You're absolutely right when you say that in the current situation where business has been either zero or very, very marginal, most organizations are looking at cash flow issues. They're looking at how do you bring down costs. At the same time, even in the short to medium term, organizations need to make sure that there is the balance with their core principles, right? From the board's perspective, what do you think? I mean, would you say that a lot of the time currently the boards would, while reviewing things like cash flow and making sure that the costs are coming down and that survival is taken care of. But would boards also be looking at the softer issues, softer within quotes, issues in terms of the core principles of an organization and getting organizations and companies to be more humanitarian and more humane in their approach? Would you think that there's a lot of that happening, or would you say the focus is going to be more on survival? And where would you say the focus is going to be more on?
You have a very good point there. And it is a way that things have shaken things up for the board of directors. And I'm not sure that it's positive overall. The usual view of this is that the board of directors of a corporation is a very unique item within the corporate structure. They have a both inside and outside view of the entity, but they also are the ones who have the long-term strategic interest of the company. Remember, the board of directors in most jurisdictions is not loyal to the management. They're not loyal to the immediate share price. Their loyalty is to the company as a separate entity and its long-term health. And that's always been the focus that boards are supposed to be looking at. Are we sustainable? Are we going forward? What are we looking at for the company 5 years, 10 years down the road? I'm afraid that the current crisis has pulled directors back from that a bit to putting out immediate day-by-day fires, worrying about things, as you mentioned, cash flow, immediate revenues. What is the next quarter going to do? How is this impacting our stock price? These are important things, and I'm afraid that they're getting directors pulled away from that long-term item here, and that can also have a impact on the directors and the board, I should say, focus on stakeholders for the corporation. Because if you're looking at short-term survival, then you have to look at, where do we cut? Who do we lay off? What facilities do we have to lay down or shut down in order to sustain the company? Those are the sort of things that boards aren't equipped well for handling, because it's essentially amputating limbs that might be needed down the road, a mile or a year or 2 years down the road. I have found this is a question that boards often have to deal with, and they wrestle with this on a day-to-day basis. And I'm afraid, as you said, they've had to take more of a short-term structure, not looking at the interest of the employees, of stakeholders, of the communities as much as they may have been able to 6 months ago. There is no solid answer for it. You have to do what you need to do to survive. I'm hoping boards will be able to get back to that long-term, what's over the hill focus going forward.
You know, in a discussion which we were having with a few board members in an organization, one of the things that came up was that a lot of what you just mentioned in terms of which factories to shut and where to bring down certain costs, etc., actually needs to be left to the management, and let management drive that. But the board should perhaps be at the directional level, and boards should perhaps go back and build on their own experience and lend that experience to the management to look at things a little more medium to long term, but agree the KPIs for the short term, which needs and issues which are more survival linked, and get the management to focus on that. But the board's attention should be more in the medium and long term. Would you say that's a better way to do it? And how should boards then go about doing that and leverage their own experience and perhaps guide management and the organization in that direction? What would you say is the best? How should boards do that? And how should individual members of the board do that? And how should the board do it from a collective perspective?
One of the benefits of a board of directors, the individual members, has always been, I like to say that a board of directors is the cheapest consulting firm that any corporation can hire. Whatever you would pay a large sum of money to a major business consulting firm to give you a long-term strategy or to shake things up, you have people who have been there and done that in their own organizations sitting in your boardroom, and you're paying them a comparative pittance. So tap into that expertise. That's been the traditional role of the directors in the boardroom. Over the last 2 or 3 months, it's become much more tactical for them. I have found directors are, as the phrase goes, leaning in more to management, saying immediate, who can I make a phone call to help us out with something here? Can I make a personal connection here? Do you want me to talk to one of our major shareholders on this? How am I negotiating things out with one of our major promoters or something of the sort? They're more and more getting involved in the organization. Can you help us find a supply chain? This current supplier is in deep financial trouble. Can you help us find a new source for this? Things like that. The directors are the people who have experience on that from their own expertise, and they're bringing that more in. So they're providing that more day-to-day tactical input with members of management, not just the chief executive, but the CFO, operating heads, and things like that. So I have seen that as a trend. Usually we tend to not encourage that in the boardroom environment. The saying, as Sir Adrian Cadbury said, the board should have its nose in but its fingers out of operations. That's been a little bit put off over the last few months, just out of necessity. And I see boards taking that more seriously and managers taking use of that. Now, while going forward, we'll have to see that a little bit less because boards won't then have the objectivity they need to supply it. Now, one of the things I like to say is the more the board is involved in management operations, the less objectivity they can bring to judging how effective those are, because it's their own ideas that are on trial. I'd like to see that going forward for the boards to start pulling back and taking more of that long term. And I like the point you made here that really coming up with the day-to-day things. Where do we cut? Do we have to make a cut back here? What might we need to be selling, say, a company facility to get us over the next 90 days? Those are the tactical ideas that the management should be coming up with. And you're right, but the board of directors needs to be asking, are we eating our seed corn going forward here? Will we be able to sustain over the next 6 months and a year? And boards need to be able to step back and take that.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. And I'm going to ask you one more question, and I'm going to go to the audience and get some questions from there and seek the help of our admin to unmute some of the audience. The question I have is, this crisis, we have a situation where most organizations are able to, at best, predict what's going to happen in this quarter. At best, maybe one more quarter. And especially because of the turbulence outside and the fact that many of them have been shut for some time, and slowly normalcy is coming back in different parts of the world and in our country as well. With one of the things that boards do every quarter is to, of course, look at performance reviews, right? We review an organization on a quarterly basis. Would you say that that should be suspended for now and do a performance review after the normalcy returns, and maybe shift the whole view and the discussion at board meetings to more immediate as well as more medium and long term, rather than look at actual performance on various elements? Would that be a more sensible way to approach things? Or would you say, no, there's a clear governance role that boards need to play, which is of reviewing performance, and it's important to make sure that that is done even during this period? What would your advice be?
The short-term performance reviews remain important, as you said here. We have to know what our cash flow is just going forward 30 days into the future here. How are we in compliance with loan covenants? Shipments, getting down to the granular level of things and keeping track of that. But I would suggest probably suspending some of the performance reviews, but gathering the information, keeping that and keeping track of where we're doing here. After we come out of this, all organizations, and not just corporations, but everything is going to have to do some serious rethinking and postmortems on how did we handle ourselves here? What did we get right? What did we do wrong? Were we able to sustain this? Were we prepared? Probably no one in the world can say we were properly prepared for what's happened over the last 3 months. But did we have the ability to at least learn from what we were doing? How have we learned this? And this is one good point to mention, management's relationship with the board of directors when it comes to a review of performance. One thing I would predict going forward is over the next 6 months or so, perhaps the rest of the year, going into 2021, there's going to be a tendency to stick with the current management team. The board of directors is going to support them. The saying of Abraham Lincoln when he ran for re-election in 1864, you don't change horses in the middle of a stream. When you're in an emergency, you have to stick with the leaders that you have. But having said that, going forward into 21 and maybe into 22, I predict we're going to see quite a few CEOs and top managers changing roles because we're going to find out they weren't up to the task. Once we're past the immediate crisis, it's going to be like the saying of peacetime generals versus wartime generals. This was someone at the head of our organization who did well when things were fairly normal and calm. They were able to manage when we were going with the flow. Now we've seen how they handle themselves in an emergency. And we're going to find that some were able to step up and manage, but we're also going to find some of our chief executives and other business leaders weren't up to the task. So I predict going forward 12 months, 18 months, we're going to see quite a bit of shakeup in leadership from people. And this is also going to inform succession planning at corporations, particularly those who are experts at it here. The rising generation of vice presidents, people who are being prepared for the next round of leadership going forward, you're going to have to shake up your job descriptions and expectations of them now, because you know what they might have to face and ask, would they be able to deal with this better than we may have worried about a year ago in dealing with an emergency situation? So that's going to inform the board's succession planning and high potential development role.
That's a very interesting point that you raise. And I think it's going to be busy times from a nominations REM committee point of view, maybe 6-9 months from now, right? And also for the HR heads of organizations to look at succession and work with the board. And I said I'm going to pass it on to the audience, but before that, the point that you raised, I need to ask one follow-up. To ensure that they are successful in what they do, should management proactively be reaching out a lot more to their boards and working perhaps a lot more closely in this period? So that, see, ultimately the point that you raised, that some people were not able to manage a crisis, right? And that, you say, hey, listen, this guy is more a peacetime general. Now, if a CEO or a CXO were to say that, maybe that's I'm a better peacetime general, how do I get better as a wartime general? Can I work with my board to learn that? Can the board hold my hand better, right? Would you see a lot of that happening? Or would you say, no, everybody's the focus is going to be more on ensuring that the job is done, and if there are going to be changes later, that will happen, right? What's your take on that? It's a very softer question that I'm asking, but I think it's a very critical thing for a lot of people to know about, I guess.
No, it is a good question here. The board of directors in most enterprises, particularly the outside independent members of the board, are coming in with some expertise and experience that's valuable. I have seen in the crisis that top managers, that the chief executive, are starting to realize that their board members are not just a group sitting around the table judging us and debating us and a nuisance that we have to put up with every quarter. These are people who know what they're talking about. They have some skills that we should be making better use of here. As I said, they're leaning in more. Managers are starting to appreciate that. Now, whether they'll appreciate it as much 6 months down the road, a year down the road, when things hopefully will get a little bit normal, I'm not so sure. But they've also discovered the talents and skills that they bring here. Boards also are a constituent body. I think you're familiar with this. All of us are in most boardrooms here. Everyone who's on the board has a particular interest. They were this round of investor. They're one of the promoters of the enterprise, that they're looking out for their own particular piece of this and presenting their own interest. Boards have brought out the best, or the crisis has brought out the best and worst among those individual board members. There are ones who are saying that when we do cut back, when we need to preserve one part of our enterprise at the expense of another, the one that I'm own, or the one that I brought into this is the one, and everything else needs to be shoved out of the lifeboat can happen. But there have also been directors who have stepped up and have been more selfless in dealing with that. So boards are a very individual item, and it's made up of individuals. Each one of them has leaned in, and each one of them has given us a measure of what kind of people they really are.
All right. Thank you very much, Ralph. I have a couple more which I'll come back with later. But at the moment, I'd like to go to the audience. Yeah. And I'd request Prashant and Munir to maybe unmute a couple of people. And those of you who are asking questions, kindly introduce yourselves and then ask your questions.
Yes, I noticed we have one asking about, quote, corporate social responsibility, what the government should be doing on CSR focus in the pandemic. He has a very good comment here. 2020 seems to be dedicated to disasters, and I think worldwide a lot of people would agree with that statement here. Corporate social responsibility has actually been sustained very well in boards of directors worldwide in this situation. There was some fear that when we have an immediate crisis, some of the things like environmental standards and stakeholder interests would have to be shoved to the side for the immediate crisis. I have not seen that happening here. And in fact, the crisis has actually strengthened some of the corporate social responsibility aspects, particularly in the Western environment where there was concern about compensation for top executives and the pay ratios between CEOs and the average employer. There has been a lot of focus and a lot of attention paid. The board has not been able to ignore that now. And in fact, it's come to the fore, because when you have to cut back on pay, when you have to lay off employees, there has been a willingness to say, all right, the chief executive, you're going to simply have to forego your pay for the next quarter. And that has happened a lot. And top executives have been taking pay cuts here going forward. There has been a willingness to sacrifice, maybe not a willingness to sacrifice, but a realization that we have to. It will simply look too bad if we have mass layoffs and the chief executive is coming away with a handsome payday. Having said that, what's going to happen going forward, I'm not so sure, because as we have found worldwide, executive compensation always tends to keep rising no matter what happens. It's a little bit like Moore's law with semiconductors. Whatever will happen, however things work out in this quarter, the long-term trend will be to push CEO pay upward. So it will be very interesting to see how that aspect of CSR works out going into 2021.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Any other questions from the audience? Would you like to, Prashant, maybe you can unmute the person who would ask for that, and you could introduce yourself and ask your questions. Yeah. I'll give it 10 more seconds. Otherwise, I'll pick up the Oh, yeah. Okay.
Hello.
Yeah.
I have got a question for Mr. Ralph.
Yes,
Good
please.
evening. This is Indian time, and I'm basically a retired person from the corporate world. My question is, in most of the time, the independent directors, they are the moot spectators in running the organizations, and with the result, whatever is required from them, that is not happening, and with the result, organizations suffer a lot, and they don't create value for the shareholders. Hello?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
we can hear you. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
So it just the observation on that, that they're not interested in shareholders overall.
Yeah, they just attend the meetings, and not much contribution coming from the independent directors.
Worldwide, that has sometimes
Change.
been a problem. Inattentiveness, every corporate scandal that happens around the world has someone asking at the end, where was the board on this? Why were they asleep at the wheel on the matter? I think the crisis will shake that up, at least in the short term, because it has been so overwhelming that no board of directors has been able to sleep through this. The idea of coming in, listening to reports and nodding and saying, fine, keep up the good work and go ahead, at least temporarily, has been impossible even for the most lax member of a board of directors. One thing I didn't mention, but I think we can see this, I bring this from a US perspective, but I think we're going to see it worldwide, is all of the things that we have dealt with over the last few months. Down the road, 6 months, a year from now, we are going to see regulators, we are going to see unhappy investors coming back with litigation and legal actions against the board. Why did you let this happen? Why weren't you prepared? How did you sleep through this? And at the moment, we tend to give our leaders and our chief executives and our boards quite a bit of slack, as you say, in this. Everyone's in an emergency. We're all pulling together. Going forward, I don't think we'll see that era of goodwill happening. And there's going to be litigation. So if you serve on a board today, that's one of the reasons why I said be sure to keep good records of what you're doing now, because someone, when this era of good feeling passes, is going to be more willing to sue you. Regulators are going to be looking at the decisions that you made today a year down the road, and you're going to have to account for them. So the slack, lax directors who aren't paying attention today have learned they had better be paying attention. Whether that good lesson of getting spanked by a crisis will stay with them going forward, I don't know. But I like to think that it will.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hello. Yeah, can I come in? Hello. Yeah,
Yes.
this is Vinita here. I just asked the question about the corporate social responsibility just now. So it just as a follow-up on that, I was just curious to know whether corporates are actually working on well-being of employees during this time, and whether there is also a collaboration between corporates and the government, or corporates multilaterals, and working towards pandemic relief. Because I represent largely the government and the World Bank.
I am seeing that at the moment. There is more a collaborative effect here between the local or the national banks and financial institutions, between the stock exchanges and the companies on trying to get through the immediate situation here. Again, I don't know how long this ability to play well together is going to last going forward here. People and institutions tend to go back to their original ways of looking out for each other on this. But I would like to think that we're going to see more stakeholder and employee empowerment coming out of this, because companies are having to lean on their employees to get them through this situation now. And they're going to have to take a lot more focus on their employee well-being here, and not just simply in laying people off and cutting back. When you are bringing them in, how do you keep them healthy? How do you keep them safe? Or companies are having to be responsible for doing that now. And that's a role that they haven't really had to deal with in the past, beyond usual safety regulations that have had to deal with employees. Now suddenly they have to keep them from getting infected. How do you make sure that someone is healthy on a day-to-day basis? Companies haven't had to worry about that, but now it's being forced on them. And I think that's informing the relationship with their employees now. We have to worry about their health inside and outside the company more than we were 6 months ago.
Absolutely. Does the government policy work in a way that says that you can't lay off people for during this pandemic? Does it really work on the ground?
I think, go ahead, Raj, you had a...
No, go ahead, after you, Raj.
No, I was going to say that it's something that all companies are having to make up day to day as they go along, as we're reopening here. I simply don't know. I've learned in life to say what I know about things, and things that I don't know about, to honestly say I don't know how that's going to shake out going forward here.
Sure.
But the lessons learned are going to be very interesting. It's sort of the way we've had to deal with airport and flight security 20 years ago here. We're going to have to invent all new rules and somehow make them work in a manageable way. Now we're going to have to deal with an ongoing infection and pandemic issue in our workplaces, and we're having to invent it as we go along. What the ultimate model will be is anyone's guess at the moment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Vinita, just to answer your question from a corporate perspective, I think the government did come with rules saying that you should not lay off people in this period. Then there was a controversy around that. But I think most good corporations have been good with that. They've not laid off people. And very importantly, I think when corporations are beginning to come back to slowly normalcy in offices and factories and stores opening up, I think everybody is using the guidelines that have been given out for ensuring health and safety and wellness, which is a very good sign. And so I think there is a lot of that happening, and we see a lot of positive from that perspective. Now, like Ralph said, let's hope that lasts and that goes into the next phase. Let's hope that happens. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Yes. And you also had a good question here about private sector companies having nominations from federal and state governments for their board members. That's something that we may be seeing here as part of the economic workout here, with every country having to come up with funding to help support vital industries during this time. There has been a lot of investment, there have been a lot of tax cuts, there have been aid going to companies. Governments are going to want something back from their money. They're going to want to have more of a say in the boardrooms of those companies. So temporarily, I would not be surprised if we were to see in some national regimes, we would like to have someone from a state ministry serve on your board of directors for the time being to represent our interest. We have made a major investment in keeping your company healthy going forward. We want to say in the governance of that. Whether it will work out long term, I'm not so certain, but I would not be surprised to see that become a short-term normal.
Yeah, I thought so, Ralph. And I think that's why I asked this question, because this, I think, would be the true beginning of a public-private partnership in corporate governance. And what CSR is about is this kind of partnership. And if it was to be built in a formal board structure, it would have very major implications for, I think, transforming the governance landscape, not only in the governments, but also in the private corporate sector.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question before we wind up this evening. So can we have a last question, please? If there is one, otherwise I'm going to have one question for Ralph.
Yes, sir. I like your questions. They're very good ones.
Ralph, are you getting a question now?
Yes, I haven't gotten any new ones here, though.
Okay. All right. Then I have one final one for you.
Yes, sir.
In this situation, as we come back to normalcy, we talked about management having its role and boards having its role. One of the things which does happen as part of daily life is other emergencies within a board. Say that an exit from a at a CXO level, etc. How should boards go about handling that? Right? You did mention that boards would like to see stability at this period, and perhaps take decisions on people only after this normalcy returns, and maybe 6 months later or 9 months later. But there are sometimes emergencies that happen. But given the the situation today, some people believe that boards will not go out and recruit people completely from the outside, but would perhaps delve deeper into organizations and take a chance on perhaps people not at the CXO level, but people below, and say, let's run with them temporarily, right? So the jury's out on that. But what would your advice be?
That's an excellent point, and it's really something that I hadn't dug into by that depth. But remember the metaphor we spoke about earlier here, peacetime generals versus wartime generals. In most long war campaigns, you find that the generals at the end who are successful, who are have the top ranking commands, were often minor officers at the beginning of the war. They proved themselves in the course of the experience and rose in the ranks, and simply made it because of the expertise that they showed in the field. And we may well see more of that here, because the boards having to work more closely, not just with the chief executive, but with all of the top management team, are getting their exposure to who's good and who isn't in the organization, who is up to the task of what's happening right now, and who is failing on this. And that's going to inform their own succession planning going forward on this. And one point you raised here, boards have had to learn the importance of crisis plans going forward and having them ready on a moment's notice here. And that comes to do with top chief executive planning here. At so many organizations around the world, CEO emergency succession is handled as a name in an envelope. If the CEO falls off the back of his yacht while somewhere, this is the person who will pull out the name out of the envelope, and this is the person. Typically, it will be the person who's next in the chain of command or something here. Boards have found out that isn't acceptable anymore because there are too many factors here. Someone might get ill in the organization that was the number 2 name in the organization. What do we do then? We have to do a deeper job of crisis management, leadership planning here. The chief executive, has happened at several organizations, came down with the COVID infection. They were out of the office and completely off the grid for a couple of weeks. What do we do then? The situation we saw in Britain when the prime minister came down with the infection and was out of pocket for a couple of weeks. Britain has never had to deal with a temporarily incapacitated prime minister. Well, what do? They had to rustle up a way of dealing with that on a temporary basis. Is your corporation? What would happen if they were in the same situation? The chief executive simply cannot be the chief executive for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. What do you do on a temporary basis? How do you handle that? How much depth do we have in crisis planning for leadership? That's something that boards are having to deal with and put together these plans in the immediate here and now.
Yeah, and I think that's something which NRC is already working on, double time to make sure that those things are answered, and they have a sufficient list of emergency successors, and it's done in a thought-through manner and through a process of evaluation and discussion. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Ralph, it's been a really energizing, informative session. I think we've looked at the entire, a lot of areas. We've covered a lot of ground here in terms of from the actual nuts and bolts of how virtual meetings can be handled and how both can be more effective. Looking at the role of a board in a situation like, and can and far more effective in emergency and crises. And I think your wisdom in terms of what both should be doing in and on term, and letting management focus on the short term to make sure that survival is ensured, and that we are doing more than just succeeding in this journey going forward. Really insightful, eye-opener. Some of the advice that you've given us is going to help a lot of us in our debates and discussions with our own management teams and boards, etc. And thank you very much for that. And big shout out and thank you to the folks who joined us today. We've had a little more than 100 people. And thank you very much to those who asked questions. Right? And thanks a lot. And we hope that this session was as informative and energizing for you as it was for us in putting this together. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you all. And I hope I get a chance to work with and speak with our attendees going forward here.
Yeah, I'm sure we will be able to organize that and help you with that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Raj, for excellent moderation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.